The scapegoat child's role and symptoms in narcissistic abuse. If you grew up with a narcissistic parent and felt devalued most of the time, then you were likely that parent's scapegoat. The scapegoat is someone who must embody what the narcissistic parent cannot stand in themselves. So by finding what the parent hates in themselves to be in the scapegoat child, the parent gets to feel protected from these feelings. And this is the role of the scapegoat child. So this child has to maneuver themselves to participate in their narcissistic parent's projections. So these maneuvers are necessary to manage the terrifying awareness that their own parent is hostile towards them, hostile towards their growth, their joy, and their authentic self. Participating with the narcissistic parent's devaluation of them can actually make this situation survivable. The ways a child learns to participate in their devaluation can be thought of as the symptoms of the scapegoat child. Well, in today's video, I describe how the role and symptoms of being the scapegoat child make it possible to attach to a hostile parent. Then I explain how gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser helps you recover from the role of scapegoat. And last, I discuss how living in defiance of the narcissist's rules helps you relieve the symptoms. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in helping people recover from narcissistic abuse. This form of abuse can leave us feeling lost and estranged from our very senses of who we are in the world. And in individual therapy and through my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse, I try to offer a map that allows survivors to come back to the quality of life they know they've deserved all along. And although each survivor has to travel this path themselves, I think a map can be tremendously helpful. And there are 3 features on this map that I call the 3 pillars to recovery. Pillar number 1 involves making sense of what happened so that you know it wasn't your fault. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance, whether psychological, emotional, or even physical, gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser. And pillar number 3 is living in defiance of the narcissist's rules. And lastly, you can't do this in a vacuum. I think it's essential to find and participate in communities who can support and validate you along this path. Today's video falls under the pillar number 1, making sense of what happened. And another great resource, I think, to help with pillar number 1 of making sense of what happened is my free ebook on surviving narcissistic abuse as the scapegoat. You can find the link to the ebook in the description below or by clicking here. How the scapegoat role develops. A narcissistic parent is in a constant battle to keep their own self-hatred at bay. They deny such feelings and insist on their opposite. Instead of experiencing themselves as worth less than others, they are worth more. They relocate their bad feelings into the scapegoat child and then exaggerate their own good feelings. This results in devaluing that child while requiring excessive admiration and obedience from that child and from others. A scapegoat child's growth threatens the narcissistic parent's fragile and inflated self-worth. Growth is a vitalizing and self-enhancing experience. Such experiences will conflict with the child seeming less than the narcissistic parent. So the scapegoat child's growth puts them at odds with the narcissistic parent. And if the child revels in their developmental achievements, then they will likely be met with more hostility from the parent. But if they disown their expanding abilities, they may be spared this hostility from the parent. And it's only that latter strategy that actually feels survivable to the child, because the parent's hostility at this base level just feels so searing and painful. Well, a scapegoat child can disown their own growth by adopting beliefs of being defective and even dangerous. So in the first case, the child doubts their ability to grow. They may see themselves as dispossessed of their own expanding capabilities. In essence, sort of believing that they can't do anything right. A scapegoat child who believes their growth is dangerous will also disavow it. Like, for instance, their increasing physical strength could make them fear hurting others, or their developing sexual identity might be felt to be sinister and shameful. Third, their increased perceptiveness of what's going on around them, of how other people are thinking and feeling, could be thought of as destructive towards those others. So the scapegoat child's role requires them to sacrifice their own growth to remain less than the narcissistic parent. The child has to collude with the parent's claim that the problem in their relationship is the child's growth. The child has no recourse to the real problem, that the narcissistic parent cannot tolerate the child's development. Now the parent seems less cruel when they are hostile towards the scapegoat child's displays of growth. So a child who believes their own growth is defective or dangerous can see their parent's hostility as justified. The parent is no longer wrong for treating the child with contempt. It's what the child deserves for growing. Because in this system, that growth is an offense. So the functions of the scapegoat child's role. Once the child accepts the scapegoat role, they have a way to attach to a rejecting parent. And the child faces rejection because they are accused of being what the narcissistic parent rejects in themselves. In fact, the narcissistic parent will refuse to know this child in any other way. So now the child stomachs their feelings of hurt and anger at this form of the parent's cruelty. The child tells themselves they deserve such treatment after all. And that's what these beliefs about their growth being defective and dangerous are telling them. So assuming the scapegoat role also lets the child perceive the narcissistic parent as good and helpful to the child. And these are necessary perceptions to survive, especially as a small child. With these kinds of beliefs, the child gets to live in a world with a parent who's only trying to correct their wicked ways. The parent is not their enemy, even though the child is treated like the parent's enemy. So if the scapegoat child experiences themselves to be wretched, then they can still seek help from their narcissistic parent. And many scapegoat survivors are familiar with a strong pull to go towards their narcissistic parent with their own problems. So the way the child learned to cope with the parent's demand that there be something wrong with the child can prevent the child, and maybe even later the adult, from sort of seeing what the parent has done and is doing to them. Instead, the child or survivor sees the parent as someone who might help them fix what is wrong with them. And maybe this means being told more things that are wrong with the scapegoat child or survivor, and so it goes. I think that without distance from a narcissistic parent or abuser, such a cycle can continue kind of into perpetuity. How the child participates as the scapegoat. Well, everything I have explained so far is kind of at a conceptual level. I think in practice, this can happen very fast for the child and the narcissistic parent. And it's in interactions with the parent when the child can sort of suddenly find themselves to deserve the parent's abuse. So the child is aware that the hostile parent knows there's something fundamentally wrong with the child. Being treated this way by the narcissistic parent can sort of feel like an invasion of the child's mind, or even like being possessed. The child's feeling of being deeply defective is sort of intrusive, disturbing, smothering, and inescapable in these moments. In contrast, the narcissistic parent finds themselves and is found by the child to seemingly be flawless. This is because the scapegoat child is full of all the flaws, as it were. And it must be this way for this sort of system to exist. The system must exist also for the child and the narcissistic parent to kind of go on being with one another, to share a reality. I'm going to talk about a fictional client named Isaiah, who had, again, this is all anonymized, but had been in therapy for several years. He had come to treatment because he couldn't shake a sense of feeling deeply inadequate. And he felt this way no matter how he was received at his work, in his friendships or relationships. And in all those venues, they tended to be positive towards him. He was well aware that his narcissistic mother had forced him into the scapegoat role. But now he and his therapist were identifying how this role showed up when he got close to people today. Well, one session, Isaiah was talking about being happy that he was going to be promptly reimbursed by his insurance for the sessions. He said, I can't believe the insurance company is being an efficient provider for me. He liked to play with words, and so that was kind of how he expressed it. And his therapist was struck by the term and said, well, what about inefficient providers? Are you familiar with that experience? Immediately, Isaiah was convinced that his therapist was pointing towards his own psychopathology. Isaiah thought, the therapist must be referring to how I don't give people enough of a chance, that if they don't provide for all of my needs perfectly, I just drop them. He thinks I am narcissistic, and I must be, said Isaiah. He also felt guilty of these thought-of accusations. He felt instantly lower than his therapist, and a searing shame came over him. He could not say or do anything to prove his innocence, but maybe he could get his sentence reduced. So Isaiah tried to cut his therapist off at the pass and preemptively see himself as defective. He said, well, yeah, I guess I have often cut people out when they don't meet my needs. I guess I'm too sensitive about that stuff. But then Isaiah stopped, and his mind settled a bit. He had developed enough of a sense of trust towards his therapist after a few years that he said to him and the therapist, but wait a minute, why did you ask me that question about what it's like or the experience of being an inefficient or receiving inefficient provision or from an inefficient provider? His therapist said, well, you said efficient provision, and I was struck by it. I thought it might open something important up. I wasn't sure what, but I went with where my instinct took me. Isaiah exclaimed, wow, I just realized that I heard your question as an indictment of my character, that you had found what was wrong with me and you were leading me to see what it was. I thought you were laying bare how I am really the narcissistic one who can't stand imperfections in others. Well, even as Isaiah talked about it, he still felt like he was in the kind of initial situation. He said, it feels like something permanent, like there's nothing to be done to fix or repair this feeling that I'm defective. Isaiah's experience with his therapist shows how quickly the ways of participating in a narcissistic relationship can show up. Just like in earlier situations with his narcissistic mother, he had to be who was wrong in the situation initially, like in this example with his therapist. And that's why he was flooded with the thoughts of his therapist implying he was intolerant of others' imperfections, that in fact the problem was Isaiah. But in this case, he had enough trust in his therapist and distance from his narcissistically abusive mother that he could question this process. He asked his therapist what the therapist meant by the question, and his therapist's answer shed light to both of them of how fast and consuming the scapegoat role could strike Isaiah. Well, maneuvers like the one Isaiah made in this session are born out of having to attach to a hostile narcissistic parent. By assuming the role of scapegoat, Isaiah got to share a reality with such a parent. So he had a narcissistic mother who would very much see him as having something wrong with him. And so he had to assume that identity to share a reality with her. He had to suffer tremendously, but it was better than having no shared reality with anyone, which would have been the case for him as a child. The scapegoat child's symptoms. The symptoms of the scapegoat child are the ways the child must treat him or herself to comply with the scapegoat role. And this can mean constructing an inner critic that is hellishly harsh. The child can feel like everything they do is embarrassing, stupid, and or wrong. It may be quite different on the outside, but this is often what can go on the inside for the child. The symptom of anxiety can be very prominent. The scapegoat child feels an ongoing inevitability that someone else will discover their defects, and that can feel threatening, which can result in anxiety. Unkind relationships can be another symptom. Since the scapegoat child's mind is so primed to be found as defective, the child may find friends who treat them poorly too. They may seek the only reality they know in their family outside of their family as well. By design, the scapegoat child is not allowed to feel esteem towards himself or self-esteem. So feeling proud of oneself would have prevented them from being the scapegoat to the narcissistic parent. And the consequence of this can be a symptom of sort of chronic depression marked by kind of a low-level hopelessness. I mean, life without the possibility of self-worth can can be a very dreary proposition. And while it's being endured, I think understandable feelings of depression can be felt and usually endured, but nonetheless present. How about the way out? Well, I believe that it is possible to find relief from the scapegoat role and its symptoms. The scapegoat role is an experience that happens in interaction with a narcissistic abuser. And this is why the second pillar of recovery, getting distance from a narcissistic abuser, is so important. Survivors need to protect themselves from more experience, which requires them to inhabit the role of scapegoat. And in Module 3 of my online course for recovery from narcissistic abuse, I go into just this topic. I address the challenges in creating such distance. It can be actually more difficult to create distance from a narcissistic parent than from a good enough parent. And that stands to reason because a good enough parent wants a child to individuate and flourish, while a narcissistic parent certainly does not. Finally, I offer concrete strategies to achieve the needed distance from a narcissistic parent. And you can find the link in the description box below or by clicking here. The symptoms of being the scapegoat can eventually be relieved, I believe, by living in defiance of the narcissist's rules. So just like Isaiah stopped going down the rabbit hole of pathologizing himself in the example above, or at least beginning to question it, by asking his therapist what the therapist meant by the question, he defied that earlier rule from his narcissistic mother that he was never to question someone in authority. Well, there are infinite other ways that a scapegoat survivor might defy the narcissist's rules, and defying these rules often happens most effectively in new, safe relationships with others. And of course, it can be a challenge itself to believe that there are safe people out there and to find them and cultivate relationships with them. Doing experiments like Isaiah did with his therapist, I think, is a good way to find out if someone is in fact safe. Other examples could include telling a friend when they have hurt, irritated, or angered you. If they respond in a way intended to mend the friendship, then that's a likely indicator of being safe. If they get defensive and blame you, then that can likely mean they are not safe based on how you feel in response. Another resource to support your efforts to live in defiance of the narcissist's rules is Module 5, again in my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse. In this module, I discuss how to identify and challenge the beliefs that are often held by scapegoat survivors. You can find the link in the description box below or by clicking here. Well, thanks again for tuning in this week. I say it every week, but it's just incredible to me to read everyone's comments, see the support offered often to the video, to some of the content, to helpfully challenge some of the points that are made. I certainly read them and take them in and find all of the feedback really helpful. And it's also great, as I've said many times, to see the support offered to one another. And the other thing I want to just emphasize is that through all of this, offering yourself patience and compassion as you go through this, I think, is sort of the always on the marquee in these efforts at recovery. Well, with that, thanks. I look forward to posting again next Friday, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.